All right, ladies and gentlemen, so let's continue. We have spoken about modernity, enlightenment being the heart of modernity. We have spoken about essence of enlightenment, essence of modernity is to rationalize every aspect of human existence. We have mentioned Immanuel Kant, who spoke about the motto of enlightenment is to have intellectual courage, to use intellect, again, intellect understood from the perspective of enlightenment. And we have finished by saying that the paradigm of modernity claims to be universal. It is not particular to Europe or to West, it is applicable to the whole humanity. And as you know, modernity criticizes religion, strongly criticizes religion from the modern perspective, and that's we getting to being Muslim, being a believer. From modern perspective, religion today and always, religion were the causes of war. And from this context, you understand the criticism, the Islamophobic attack on Islam for terrorism and jihad. It fits perfectly in the paradigm of modernity, because when they hear religion, they think of religious war, something which Europe went through and managed to resolve, as they believe, the conflict through secularism and the Westphalian Peace Treaty, end of religious wars in Europe. It is only from modern perspective we can actually make sense of the term fundamentalist. Fundamentalist is the believer who did not go through the modernization. In a pre-modern paradigm, there is no difference between fundamentalist and believer. And it's not to justify terrorism or ISIS. We know these people don't represent us at all. We speak about modern perspective of what Islam is, what religion is. Modernity claims if we liberate the people, again, liberation in a modern perspective, liberation from perspective of modernity, if you liberate the people from the religions, from this religious legacy and tradition, from revelation, from Bible, Quran, and Torah, by liberating them, liberating their intellects first of all, then we will have finally the peace on the earth. Because them, guided by the intellect, inevitably they will conclude that peace is better than war. Because from modernist perspective, all these wars which were happening in ancient time, these wars were not fought in the interest of people. They were fought in the interest of nobility, in the dynastical interest, and also caused by this religious time of intellectual darkness. And this belief in universal freedom, universal rationality, universal brotherhood, surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, serves as a best justification for expansion, for colonization, for the conquest. That's how the ideas of enlightenment were spread. We live in South Africa, and the South Africa, at least in terms of its political structures, we know they're based on modern project. It was not a result of the conversation between all ethnicities. It's not that we have Malay people, Indian people, Nguni tribes, indigenous African or Khoisan people gathered together, and they have arrived to the idea of modern social organization. No, we know that these ideas were spread by the sword. The whole Africa has been colonized in the time of modernity. It was not the Catholic empire of pre-modern times. Colonization of Asia, colonization of Australia, only in Latin America, yes, we can speak about Latin America speaking Spanish as a result of those who spread Catholicism, but colonization is what serves and what follows from these ideas of enlightenment and liberation. And I think that's the only way to reconcile this slogan of liberté, égalité, fraternité, and enslavement and the genocide of the whole people. Why? Because those nations and ethnicities, tribes that were colonized and were denied the human treatment. From their perspective, can you speak about them as a fully complete human being when they still live according to tradition, still live according to their culture and according to their heritage and legacy? I think that one of the best examples is recent, not that recent anymore, but intervention of America into the affairs of Iraq War, American interference. As you know, first the pretext was weapons of mass destruction, which supposedly Saddam Hussein had. The weapons of mass destruction were not found, but then George Bush said, justifying it, yes, we did not find the weapons, but at least we removed the tyranny and we established democracy. This in itself justifies the intervention to bring people democracy, or sometimes to educate people the ideas of enlightenment, democracy, liberalism, so they could be able to catch up with the Western, with the European, or you can say Euro-American Western move and progress in a history. And this colonization and the situation such as Afghan war, Iraqi war, we know that it resulted in dehumanization of the enemy. We have this very enlightenment country such as United States of America, the bastion of democracy, the one who is actually able to evaluate who is democratic and who is not, but at the same time we have Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, seemingly in the most democratic countries producing it. Speaking about this, in the 20th century, German thinker, legal theorist Carl Schmitt, to explain, he introduced the concept of total war. So when he speaks about the wars before, which is the war that would be fought in the pre-modern world, for example, between Salahuddin Ayyubi and Richard the Lionheart. When there was a war, and there's possibility for peace treaty. Yes, it was a temporary peace treaty because they know that there is a clash of interest, there is a different belief, but at the same time there is a respect for your opponent, for your enemy. And then, as we know, the whole European ideas of chivalry was the result of cultural appropriation of the Muslim concept of futuwa. There is nothing else. You won't find it anywhere among the barbarians, of the native barbarians of the Europe. That was the futuwa from the Muslims. So we see there is an appreciation of your enemy, giving him what is due to him, even though you meet him in a battle. Also Westphalian system. Westphalian system recognized the sovereignty of the law of the land. So the prince or the governor, whoever rules the land, he is the one who defines religion. With all its secularization, there was recognition that there is an enemy, peace treaty is possible, and the war is possible. Now, in the modern world today, Enlightenment told us the war is inherently bad, but at the same time, what it means that all those who don't subscribe to the ideas of Enlightenment, they must be essentially dehumanized, because it is not a human being which has a different view from others. It is essentially a subhuman who rejects the intellect the way we understand it, who rejects the ideas of democracy, of liberalism, and all those social phenomena that modernity has produced. That's how, logically, from the ideas of Enlightenment, we move to Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. So we spoke about modern times and modernity. Now a bit about being Muslim in this time. So what is to be done? My suggestion, and I think that follows from everything what I have said before, we have to engage modernity critically. And when I say critically, I don't mean with prejudices, I don't mean negatively. The word critically comes from the Greek krito, which means to judge based on its value, understanding the evidence, the proof, the value. You have to engage modernity, but you must understand what modernity is. Because in the world today, in our Muslim communities, we have two typical approaches to modern world. First one is lack of any engagement, is the rejection, unconditional. So you say that everything what modernity brings, we reject it. Universities, public education, we reject it. Modern technologies, we reject it. The knowledge which West has discovered and accumulated and perfected, we reject it. So to the extent that some people say that even education must be deprived because education is informed by the modern world. Now, this approach, you can ignore modernity, but it's very difficult to ignore the fact that you live in a world which is shaped by modernity. The only way for you to really try to leave the situation is to go somewhere to the deserts of Mauritania, where modernity did not reach itself. But then that is the matter of your personal salvation. What about us Muslim as a community? So this is one approach, which I don't want to use the terms such as conservative or ultra-conservative. It is the lack of engagement, rejection, outright. Another approach, which is another extremity, is the uncritical engagement, which means approval, unconditional approval of all the ideas of modernity, which is known as modernism. So the idea of modernism is that as Muslims, we are behind. We must catch up with the ideas of modernity because we as Muslims, we still stuck in the Middle Ages, where religion still defines our not only private but public affairs as well, and we have to modernize itself. We also have to go through the process of reformation, when we will allow everybody to interpret Quran and Sunnah in the same way as Martin Luther allowed everybody to interpret the Bible. Is the approach sola scriptura, that you have only Quran and Sunnah and you don't need scholarly legacy at all, and other ideas of modernists. In our previous seminar with Dr. Ali briefly mentioned the person of Jamaluddin Afghani, who was, you could say, our very own Muslim Martin Luther, or at least who saw himself as the one who will modernize the Islam. So the works of Jamaluddin Afghani, of his student Muhammad Abdo, of the student of Muhammad Abdo, Rashid Rida, them and those who followed them, their students and those who accepted their ideas, this is the modernism. This is idea that Islam is outdated, so we need somehow to reform Islam to do the same what happened in the West with the Christianity. Now, before commenting on both of this approach, I just want to state that these two approaches, there's nothing new in history. This challenge, intellectual challenge, already happened before in the history of this ummah, in the first centuries of Islam, when the Darul Islam, its borders were expanded. Thank you. And then, as a result of it, there was interaction between Muslim ummah, Muslim global community, and the civilization that surrounded. There was the ancient knowledge of Greeks entered in the field, when the works of the ancient Greeks were translated into Arabic, and you know, this ancient Greek knowledge, it is a rediscovery of ancient Greek knowledge, Greek and Roman, which made a Renaissance possible. You could also think about what revolution, at least in the minds, it made in a Muslim world. And as a result of this ancient knowledge, of the philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, being now appropriated or interfered in the Muslim space, and it also produced two reactions, two responses. One response was rejection, the same what we have today. Rejection of the Greek philosophy, rejection of using logic, and at the end of the rejection of the intellect. So you believe, you get saved by your belief, you don't use intellect to understand Quran, and then as a result of it, we have literalist understanding of Quran, and out of this group, later we will have Wahhabis, understanding of Quran and Sunnah without intellect. First, it began only on a level of theology. Then it will also, literalist understanding will be spread to the field of Muslim jurisprudence, fiqh, which characterizes Wahhabis who are more modern, not 2 centuries before with Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, but modern Wahhabis, those who are mostly associated with the, for example, Sheikh Nasser al-Albani, literalist approach, rejection of the whole intellectual tradition of jurisprudence. And as a result, from Wahhabis, we naturally move to ISIS. Here we got rejection of the intellect and dark ages in some areas in Syria. This is one approach or one response. Second one, engaging the ancient Greek legacy uncritically, unconditionally accepting its premises, which also happened in a Muslim history. This is the beginning of this ancient sect, which are known as Mu'tazilis. The name Mu'tazili comes from Arabic i'tizal, meaning those who split away, break away from the main body of Muslim community. And this heresy became so strong that the sect actually became influencing Khalifa of those time, who actually started persecuting all those who disagreed with the Mu'tazili legacy. But then we have appearance of what is known as Ash'ari school of thought, which combined, I don't want to say reconciled, because there is no contradiction to reconcile, but those who have were guided both by the revelation and the intellect, and prove that there is no contradiction between revelation and the intellect. This is the Ash'ari school of thought, or Ash'ari school of Kalam, Islamic theology, which defended the original teaching of Islam, defended the orthodoxy from both Mu'tazilis and those who have rejected using of logic and intellect. And thanks to this, thanks to the victory of Islamic orthodoxy, later we will have Baytul Hikmah in Baghdad. Where Baghdad, before it was destroyed by the Mughals, was the center of civilization, what Europeans were still barbarians. Thanks to this appropriation of the legacy and critical engagement, taking what is beneficial, such as, for example, Aristotelian logic, and rejecting the certain metaphysical, theological assumption by the ancient Greeks. This is what took us to the height of the Baghdad, center of the Islamic civilization, center of the human civilization of those times, without any exaggeration. So before I conclude, I just want to critically engage few of these phenomena which are growing up from the paradigm of modernity. We mentioned the modern understanding of intellect, which is the intellect is only applicable to time and space, and that's why intellect is not applicable to the divine, not applicable to metaphysics, what is beyond our sensual world, and that's why it's not an intellectual conversation about God, it's a spiritual conversation, but spiritual, it's only concerned with your private life, what is more comfortable for you. This is the role, or the place and role of religion today. Now, what is being Muslim? And what do we as Muslims, what could we say about intellect? You know that intellect is categorically praised in the Quran. You won't find any Quran which rejects intellect or condemns intellect. You always find the ayats, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ أَفَلَا يَنْظُرُونَ أَفَلَا تُبْصِرُونَ أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. So why won't they reflect? Why won't they think? Why won't they see? And in fact, it is intellect which elevates us above the animals. It is the intellect which makes us responsible for our actions and makes us responsible after our death on the day of judgment. Because if you don't have intellect, Muslim scholars would say when Allah speaks in the Quran, He's not addressing to you. In the same way, He's not addressing rocks, inanimate objects. He's addressing to those who are able to understand. This is whom the message is sent. So intellect, we accept it. But do we mean we accept it in a modern, the concept of modernity of intellect, that intellect being only reduced to space and time? Not necessarily. You find that Dr. Ali spoke about last Ottoman emperor. I will mention the last Sheikhul Islam of Osmanli Caliphate. Sheikh Mustafa Sabri, for example, engaged, and it is not known. We believe that this Western philosophy like a final state, but he engaged, critically engaged, and refuted the arguments of Kant, of Hegel, and other Western philosophers in his 5 volumes book, which is called in Arabic, موقف العقل والعلم والعالم من رب العالمين, meaning the relation of intellect, knowledge, and this world to the Lord of the worlds. So what is the relation between them? When he said that this statement of Immanuel Kant, this is the atheism, this is the pure rejection of divine as it is in its pure form. So do we say that intellect is necessarily limited by space-time? Not necessarily. There are certain things we can talk about, like we talk about love and hate, for example. Does love and hate necessarily placed in space and time? Can it be located spatially? Not necessary. We speak about certain other concepts, for example, counting 1, 2, 3, 4. Are these numbers in themselves as concepts located in space and time in relation to each other? Not at all. So Intellect is able to go beyond space and time. This is very simple, and this limitation to space and time, it is the assumption which still requires to be proven. We are taught about intellect. We also taught today, obviously, one of the strong criticism of Islamophobes against Islam is idea of equality. Islam is still archaic, it's outdated because it advocates inequality. The thing is, can absolute equality be equal? This also topic we must engage. Equality can be possible in a specific matters. For example, when there is a demand for wage gap, for example, there's an argument that women and men are not paying the same and women are paid less just because they're women, but for doing the same work. Can we say that this equality can be achieved? Yes, there is nothing self-contradictory in this argument. But equality in absolutely every aspect of human life. This is something we still have to reflect on it. For example, most of this event I am speaking and you are listening to me. So this is already inequality. You accepted this inequality. How are we going to rectify it? Must we have some sort of affirmative action to rectify and remedy this? Not necessarily. So can equality be achieved? This claim of modernity that achieving equality and liberty, it has to be engaged, it has to be critically engaged by the Muslim without passive acceptance and without rejecting the dialogue itself. Another, as you know, claim and another slogan is liberté, liberty. Islam is seen as something which enslaves. You know, the famous statement that human being is born free, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, human being is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Yes. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Social Contract, beginning of his work. Even this statement, but is it so obvious? Does actually human being born free? Because in reality, when he is born, he can be anything but free. He is so dependent on his mother, on the people around them. I mean, you obviously, somebody might argue, but still he is not able to even act. Can we actually speak about freedom? But the whole fact of him being born, is it as a result of his conscious will, him realizing his freedom to come into this existence? Nobody was asking him. You know, when sometimes children argue with their parents, they say, I did not ask you. I did not ask you to take me to this world. I mean, it might sound rude. Philosophically, it's on a solid, correct ground. He did not ask, and he was brought into this existence to face the challenges and troubles and sometimes severe tribulation of life. And by the way, speaking of this, it is what I'm saying is not me making it up. You have a professor of ethics in UCT, David Benatar, I believe, who is the author of this concept in ethics, or the teaching, we could say, theory of antinatalism, where he advocates that people should not have children, because by giving birth, you doom a child for suffering in life. But it makes sense. It makes sense because if you take the God out of picture, why are we going through our life every day facing problems? And even when we're not facing problems, we're still facing the biggest problem, which is our mortality, if you remove God from the picture, which we all try to cope, and the whole industry of entertainment, of consumerism is trying to cope us with it, but with the emptiness inside, how we deal with it. So are we free? Are we free when we are born? Not even to mention that as we grow up, from childhood we go to when we become adults, we're still not free because we're in need of society. I mean, speaking about it, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle defined human being as social animal. Social, he'll say, politikon zoon, which animal which lives in polis. Polis for him was their society. This was the synonym. So the animal which lives in polis, in society, is the human being, which means that you need society to be a human being. You're in need of it. As Aristotle would say, if you don't need polis, if you don't need society, you're either above the human being, then you are God, because God don't need society, or you are below the human being, you are animal. Or even you look at it sociologically, what are all of us, if not just the set of social roles that we play? Teacher, student, mother, father, lecturer, friend, neighbor, employee. Society defines us, absolutely. And by the way, when you speak about freedom or liberty, there is, as you know, modernity produced very influential ideology of liberalism. And the liberalism accepts essentially the current status of lack of freedom and say that we must liberate individual from all kind of these socially imposed limitations and identities. And you know that this project of liberalism was going very successfully when first individual was liberated from religion. This has happened, Reformation, secularization. Human being has been also liberated from ethnical identity, because it's ethnicity, you don't choose it. You're given it by your parents, the language you taught, the fairy tales you told before you sleep, the cuisine that you are used to. It is also some kind of limitation of your freedom. As you know today, culture, ethnical culture today, in a deep crisis. So this aspect of slavery we also almost overcame. Then next step also is nationality. Nationality is also seen, but today we have already nation state doesn't play the same role, and the borders already moving, or borders are disappearing. So nationality is also not so much defines you who you are. Then liberalism make the next step, sexuality. Sexuality, it is something because you are being told who you must be attracted to. No, you must be given a choice. So sexuality is also something that you within the freedom of individual. And as you know, on a level of legislation, at least this freedom is given. Now the only conversations about how we're moving it into the sphere of culture, education, entertainment. This is sexuality. It's already dealt with. And it's already, we can say, liberals and the ideas of liberalism, in their practical application, they went very far. The next step, which still limits the freedom of individual, is gender. Gender is also something you did not choose. No, you did not choose. Now we are told, no, you do choose your gender. What do you mean you did not choose? There is a biological, but this is sex. You have biological sense and sociological gender, which you can choose. And then we have this whole idea of 3 gender, 4 gender, gender fluid, non-binary, all of this different concept, realization of freedom of individual to be who you are, who you want to be. I mean, now the next step, which technology makes possible, is actually to overcome the being human. And technologies are allowing it to happen. Already now people speak about cyborgs, so mixing human aspect and the aspect of machine or the aspects of the technique. So human, using the words of Nietzsche, is something that you must also overcome in the same way as you overcome your religion, sexuality, ethnicity, language, and everything else. Now, for us, today, when we speak about becoming cyborg, something we can maybe smile and laugh about it. But maybe only 50 years ago, when people would speak about changing gender, people were also laughing. Technologically, it's possible now, and it is happening. So as soon as technology will allow moving from the human to post-human cyborg situation, it also will happen. But this is destruction of humanity. Liberalism, in attempt to liberate the human being, essentially breaks human being into pieces. The same individual is supposed to be the one which is not divisible, like atom of the society. Now atom is into pieces. Individual is no more. Progress, optimism, very optimistic perspective. We are being told about history that the time which is coming always better than the time which was before. Modernity is always better than the ancient time. And out of these ideas of modernity, of course, we have naturally theories such as theory of evolution, for example, which thinks strictly within the scope of modernity, within the myth of development and progress. Now you have to say that this idea of progress is very new, in fact. It's only 300 years ago, it only begins with Enlightenment, as you can see. Renaissance and Reformation still looking backwards to the past for inspiration. Can we speak about progress? I think we can speak about progress in one particular field. For example, technological progress from iPhone 5 to iPhone 6. Yes, we can speak about progress. Can we speak about progress of society? Can we speak about progress of culture? Not really. I would say not really, because in culture there is no progress, but on the opposite, we have a decline. Compare us and the ancient Greeks. Between us, what, that 2,000 years or even more than 20 centuries. From the great ancient Greek culture, we have left with only works of only 3 tragedians: Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus. And there were many more. And we are still debating, trying to understand what they have written. So did we truly acquire? Are we actually culturally more rich than the ancient Greeks before? Is there a progress in culture? Not necessarily. Rather, we can speak about degradation and devolvement rather than evolution, devolution of the human species in the cultural field. Or if you look at it strictly from perspective of revelation, you know that the famous hadith, the best of generation, my generation, then those who follow them, then those who follow them. So the best generation is the Sahaba. There's the best generation, those who are there in the past, right in the beginning. The next generation is already not on their level. And the last of the third generation, not on their level. So it is actually going with the decline. And as you know, the end of the world will happen. No, it won't happen until there are people on the earth who say Allah, Allah, as it says in the hadith. So end of the world will come to the worst of the people. We're going from the best to the worst. Can we call it a progress? Not necessarily. And this is, in the field of Islamic studies, for example, we do not have accumulation of knowledge. We have only loss of knowledge, where we have the highest levels were achieved after the Prophet by the Sahaba, Tabi'in, and then finally Tabi'in, and all the founders of all 4 madhabs belong to that epoch. And nobody can come today and try to raise on their knowledge. It's not even possible theoretically. Theoretically it's possible. Practically it never happened, because knowledge is not accumulated. Knowledge is being closed, and we're trying to, as much as we can, to save what we can. I also could talk about democracy and nation states. Then we will talk about can you vote, can you get elected, can you create a political party. But I think the whole point of this talk, being Muslim in the time of modernity, and I think that's the most important thing which I want to say, is that we must talk about being Muslim not from the position of individual, but being Muslim as a community. I think we should actually say being Muslims, being a Muslim community in the time of modernity. The moment you talk about being Muslims yourself in your private affairs individually, you already accepted uncritically modern assumption that society is being made from the individual. That is what is known as social contract. When you have group of individuals gathered together and they constitute state, they constitute society, then they make laws from the bottom to the top. But it all begins from one individual. Can we speak about from us individually? We can, but then we already accepted uncritically the ideas of modernity that first and foremost we are the individuals, and then we can choose which community we can belong to the extent as what it means for us. Is it good for us or not? So I think what's important, we should not talk about being Muslim individually, but being Muslim as being member of community. I wanted to complete, there is a few paragraphs from the paper which I've written recently exactly on this topic of tradition engaging modernity. I don't want to read it all. I just want to summarize it in my own words. I think there are 3 points which I would say, and I say from my, you can say, academical perspective. By this, engagement must happen on every possible level, as long as it's happen in the level of communities, not individual. I think as Muslims, and what we must do, and what we must demand our leadership to do, our ulama, our community leaders, whoever it is, our elders, whoever it is in the position of leadership, we must know what is part of our deen which is non-negotiable, non-reformed, which cannot be compromised. which cannot be reinterpreted just because in the West, Europeans or Westerners have arrived to certain ideas. And which part of the deen? It is something what they call a social construct, which is relevant for one particular time. Because today we have a confusion about it. Today there is an attempt to reinterpret what is part of the deen. For example, meaning of prophethood, meaning of miracles. So it would fit the modern paradigm. For example, the same Muhammad Abdo, one of the founders of this modernist movement, he would deny the miracles because it does not fit into the modernist paradigm. He would deny the prophethood, receiving of revelation, say that prophethood is that Muhammad being a genius statesman, genius general, genius, you can say community leader, and he was the best community leader, but thanks to revelation. It is this crucial aspect of revelation is denied because it does not fit into modern paradigm. And as well as sometimes we have another extremity when certain things which are really cultural practices are brought in the field of the deen as it is the core of the deen. So it's often happens that certain particular social practices which are brought, for example, from subcontinent, from India and Pakistan, which are imposed as the heart of the deen, as this is the revelation, pure revelation, which must defend it. Like Sahaba and all Muslims, were living and dying exactly for that. I don't want to give example. We are all more or less familiar what I'm talking about. And I think these two categories must be defined. Now, for these two categories to be defined, I think there must be engagement, there must be research, there must be this inquiry, which I think can be only interdisciplinary. We need to bring scholars of Islamic studies, we need to have our scholars from the academy, human and social studies, natural studies, natural sciences, formal sciences, and they must have a conversation. And I think as community we must lobby for this conversation. In the same way, normally you lobby from your member of parliament, when you're popular representative, municipal, provincial, federal level, whatever, you lobby, so your interest would be protected and preserved. We must lobby for this. So there would be no separation when you have Islamic scholars, purely Islamic scholars. The graduates, let's say, of madrasa tend to reject the modern world, and the graduates of universities tend to reject or reinterpret Islam. There must be conversation, there must be convergence. And I think all of this must obviously happen when both sides will show certain level of intellectual humility and readiness to engage each other. Then we can have an intellectual breakthrough. And last, I think, but not least, I think this interdisciplinarity, for it to happen, it must be rooted in the tradition. It must be rooted in the tradition of interpretation which still exists. Legal tradition, madhab, tradition within the usulul fiqh, foundation of jurisprudence, tradition of tafsir. All of these things are relevant and continue to be relevant, and we do not have to reinvent the wheel trying to impose the modernity. When we want to revive the deen, we must do it from inside as Muslims. We don't want to come and revive the deen from outside. This is destruction of the deen. And to complete with what is tradition, Pelikan famously, what is tradition? Tradition is the living face of the dead. So tradition is rooted in the past. Tradition is the living face of the Sahaba, Tabi'in, but the faith is living, and this faith is living through us. It is this being rooted in the past, being rooted in the tradition, while engaging critically the modern reality, which I think will give us an answer what it means being Muslim in the modern times. Thank you.